The first Whitmore hire seemed like a simple favor. I want you to remember that specific word, favor. I met Grant Whitmore in 2016 at a hospital charity gala that his mother happened to chair. He's 38 now, but he was 28 back then, and he had that specific brand of handsomeness that almost apologizes for itself, which, as it turns out, is the most effective kind. He remembered my exact coffee order after just one date. He asked insightful questions and then actually paused to listen to the answers. When he first brought me to the Whitmore estate that fall, I immediately felt like I was being presented less like a girlfriend and more like a business plan. The house looked beautiful from the street. But up close, my occupational compliance habits kicked right in, and I noticed the window frames were soft with rot underneath a fresh coat of white paint. Old money with no money. I didn't have that exact phrase back then, but I certainly had the feeling. Susan Whitmore met me at the front door wearing full pearls at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. She was charming in a way that felt like being expertly handled, and she knew the first and last names of every powerful person in the county, right down to their spouses, and where their kids went to college. Over dinner, she asked me what I did for a living. I explained that I managed contracts and compliance for my father's mechanical contracting firm. Susan set down her fork, smiled at me like I'd just passed a test I didn't even know I was taking, and said, "Practical. That's exactly what this family needs." Everyone at the table laughed warmly, and I laughed right along with them, because it sounded like a genuine compliment. It took me 9 long years to realize it wasn't a compliment at all, it was a job offer. Except I wasn't the one being hired. I was the acquisition. Grant proposed the following spring at a restaurant his mother hand-picked. I said yes with my entire heart, which is the one detail I would change today if I could change anything at all. We got married in 2017 in front of 200 guests, most of whom I had never met in my life. At the reception, Susan stood up with a champagne glass and gave a grand toast that concluded with, "Family takes care of family." The entire room erupted in applause. My dad wiped a tear from his eye. I squeezed Grant's hand tightly, genuinely believing I was the luckiest woman in Franklin County. Just 6 weeks later, Susan called me directly, not my dad, but me, about Grant's cousin, Robbie. She mentioned he was between opportunities, and incredibly talented with numbers, and noted that our purchasing department had an opening. I passed his resume along to hiring with a quick note that read, "Family referral, full disclosure." I actually felt virtuous for including that disclosure. Robbie interviewed well enough and got the job. I signed his welcome packet myself, because all onboarding paperwork ran directly through compliance. I distinctively remember thinking how wonderful it was that our two families were knitting together so beautifully. I still think about that signature today. Not with guilt, exactly, but with the specific, sickening feeling of a person who realizes she held the door wide open and said, "Welcome, so glad you're here." Robbie was polite, showed up on time, and did absolutely nothing remarkable in either direction. I later learned that is exactly what the first plant is supposed to do. The first one is just a test balloon, and nobody sends the real cargo on a test balloon. That Christmas, Susan gifted my dad a bottle of scotch older than I was, telling him that Callaway Mechanical was exactly the kind of classic American success story her family was proud to be part of now. My dad glowed with pride. I glowed right alongside him. I would eventually calculate that the bottle of scotch cost roughly 1,000th of what that exact sentence was about to make her. But at the time, I just thought about how I had signed that welcome packet myself. Between 2019 and 2021, Callaway Mechanical experienced rapid growth. We had 3 major expansions, secured 2 new municipal contracts, and launched a massive hiring push to keep up. Somewhere in the middle of all that growth, a subtle pattern began to form. I noticed it the way you notice a faint, off-putting smell in a house you love. First, A scheduling clerk was hired who turned out to be Susan's goddaughter. Then, an accounts payable associate came on board whose mother played tennis with Susan every Tuesday. Next was an estimator Grant personally vouched for from his professional network, though Grant's network, as far as I could tell, consisted entirely of people his mother had introduced him to. Each resume was legally sound but thin on substance. Each interview went fine. And every single hire went directly through Marcy Holt, our new HR director. I should mention that Marcy came to us on Susan's glowing, personal recommendation right after our previous HR manager retired incredibly suddenly with a generous severance package that nobody in leadership actually remembered approving. I finally raised the issue once during a leadership meeting. I pointed out that our referral concentration was getting unusually high, and suggested we might want to implement a conflict of interest policy with a bit more teeth. Marcy laughed kindly, the exact way you laugh at a small child who's afraid of the dark. Fiona reads warranty cards for fun, she said lightly to the room. The entire table chuckled because that was my established brand within the company. But my brand also made me incredibly easy to dismiss. Dad patted my shoulder on the way out of the room. To be absolutely clear, I didn't just shrug and let it go. I wrote a formal memo. I updated our conflict of interest disclosure forms, and I made sure every single new hire signed one. It felt like I was doing something meaningful. And in a sense, it was. Years later, those signed forms would matter enormously. But a form is ultimately just a seatbelt. It doesn't stop the other driver from intentionally aiming right at you. By the summer of 2021, I counted exactly 11 hires with clear Whitmore fingerprints on them. I was about to find out exactly how they would get that number up to 27. In September of 2021, my dad suffered a major heart attack right on the shop floor. He was 60 at the time. He went down heavily between two rows of pipe stock, and a 23-year-old apprentice had to perform chest compressions until the ambulance arrived. It required a triple bypass. He survived. I need you to know right away that he lived, but he was completely out of the building for 8 long months, and the business definitely noticed his absence. I spent that entire fall driving back and forth between the hospital in Columbus and the office in Grove City. I made a choice back then that I will still defend to this day. I chose my father's heartbeat over the company org chart. But while I was focused on his recovery, Dean Whitmore, Grant's 34-year-old younger brother, a man whose previous job title I could never quite pin down, volunteered to step in and help out temporarily. That temporary help quickly turned into a dedicated desk. The desk turned into an official title, Operations Director. Meanwhile, Grant, who had joined the company 2 years earlier as a client relations VP, a position Susan had somehow managed to negotiate into existence over a dinner I wasn't even invited to, started introducing Dean to our major municipal contacts. The hiring wave that I had been watching like a hawk happened precisely while the hawk was sitting in a cardiac ward holding her mother's hand. 16 more people came on board during those 8 months. Marcy processed every single one of them. When Dad finally returned to the office, thinner, moving slower, and carrying a new aversion to conflict that the surgery seemed to have permanently installed, he looked at the updated org chart and remarked how nice it was to see so much fresh energy in the building. I looked at that exact same chart and saw a massive organ transplant that the body hadn't actually approved. I told him exactly that, gently, in his office with the door shut. He just held up a tired hand. That was the very first time I heard the single sentence that would dictate my life for the next 5 years. "You don't fire family," my dad said. He wasn't angry, he was just certain. He said it with the same absolute certainty he had about weld temperatures and honest handshakes. I didn't have concrete proof of anything yet, and I want to be entirely honest about that. What I had was a gut feeling and a diagram. One night in late 2023, unable to sleep, I sat down at my kitchen table and mapped out the entire company on a legal pad. I listed every single hire since my wedding, every referral line, and every reporting relationship. Then, I took a red pen and circled every single person connected to the Whitmores by blood, by marriage, or by tennis. When I finished, I had to count the circles twice, because I simply couldn't believe the final number. 27. There were 27 people strategically placed in purchasing, accounts payable, estimating, HR, and operations. If you know anything about how money actually flows out of a business, you know that is not a random distribution. It's a supply chain. I brought that legal pad straight to my dad the next morning. He studied it for a long, quiet minute, and I watched something flicker deep in his eyes. My dad is not a stupid man. He is a deeply loyal man, and those are two very different kinds of weaknesses. Then, he slid the pad right back across the desk to me. They are good people, Fee. Susan's people are good people. You don't fire family. He meant it as a core principle. Susan, however, had spent 6 years ensuring it would function as a master password. So, I took my legal pad, went back to my office, and did the only things I could legally do without his signature. I tightened all financial approval thresholds, mandated dual sign-offs on any new vendors, and quietly flagged my own system access to monitor every single purchasing record in the database. It felt like frantically laying sandbags before a massive storm that everyone else insisted was just pure sunshine. 2 months later, I uncovered purchase order 7734. And from that moment on, nothing about my life was ever quiet again. It was January of 2024, and I was doing the least dramatic thing imaginable, reconciling our quarterly budgets against global commodity indexes. Copper prices had dipped significantly that quarter. Strangely, our internal copper costs had not dropped at all. I ran the calculations 3 separate times. Then, I pulled 2 full years of physical invoices from our primary pipe and fitting supplier, a company called Bright Line Supply LLC. We were paying, on average, 22% above market rate. 22% is not a simple rounding error. A 22% markup on a category of that scale is equivalent to taking out a second mortgage every single year. Now, a bad price on its own isn't a crime. Sometimes it's just the result of a lazy buyer, or an old relationship that nobody has bothered to rebid. So, I did exactly what compliance professionals do. I looked up the vendor. Bright Line Supply was only 5 years old. It had been added to our approved vendor list in 2021, right during Dad's 8-month medical recovery, with a single authorizing signature, Dean Whitmore. The company's corporate address was a suite number in a Westerville office park, which, for a supposed commercial pipe distributor, is a bit like having a massive cattle ranch headquartered inside a studio apartment. Its listed registered agent was a name I had never heard of, Ted Lund, and its website consisted of just 3 pages of generic stock photos. One of those photos, I kid you not, featured a warehouse shot with the original forklift company's digital watermark still faintly visible in the bottom corner. I sat alone with all of that information for a long, incredibly careful evening. I didn't call anyone, and I didn't march angrily into anyone's office. I had already been the girl who cried pattern once before in a leadership meeting, and I had watched firsthand how fast a room full of grown corporate men can turn a woman's diligence into a company punchline. This time, I was going to count every single brick before I used the word wall. I started printing out invoices, 5 full years of them. For 3 weeks straight, my dining room table completely stopped being a dining table. I laid the invoices out in long rows by quarter, taped index cards all over the wall, and ate my meals standing up at the kitchen counter like a raccoon wearing a nice cardigan. Grant was traveling extensively that winter, allegedly for client relations, so for the most part, it was just me, a neon highlighter, and a growing coldness deep in my stomach. Here is exactly what the paperwork revealed. Brightline's pricing had crept upward in small, incredibly polite increments. It was never enough to trip an automated audit, and always remained just a hair beneath the exact threshold that would have triggered a mandatory second signature. It was the precise threshold I had set myself, which meant someone had carefully studied my fences and built their gate exactly 1 inch below the top rail. Certain purchase orders repeated themselves with identical quantities and identical line items, cadenced every few months like a steady heartbeat. And a handful of the POS, the absolute fattest ones on the table, were for materials that I couldn't cross-reference to any active job number at all. We were paying for copper fittings meant for projects that simply did not exist. I checked the physical receiving logs against those invoices. The logs were signed, initialed, fully complete, and I was heavily beginning to suspect, completely fictional. You know that bizarre feeling when a word you've read 100 times suddenly looks completely misspelled. That was what looking at my own company's paperwork felt like. Documents I had trusted implicitly for years suddenly started looking entirely staged, like the furniture inside a model home. I made a strict rule for myself that January, verify. Never assume. For every single anomaly I uncovered, I wrote down the most innocent possible explanation right next to the guilty one. And I only kept the files where innocence required a lot more imagination than guilt. By February, I had a massive stack of those files. The core question was no longer whether money was leaking out of the company. The question was exactly who was holding the bucket. And as it turned out, I was married right into the answer. I finally asked Grant about Brightline on a Tuesday night over a dinner I had cooked specifically to make the conversation feel like anything but an interrogation, which tells you pretty much everything you need to know about the marriage we had built. I kept my tone entirely light. Hey, weird question. Do you know anything about Brightline Supply? Their pricing is all over the place and I can't seem to find much information on the company. Grant's fork paused in mid-air for a fraction of a second. If you've